Ben leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with fatigue as the truck hummed quietly in the background. He glanced over at Sam, who was fiddling with a map, still looking green after their long haul through Texas. The truck stop was empty, save for the occasional truck that passed by on the highway, its headlights flashing in the distance. "Another quiet night," Ben muttered, stretching his legs out. The air was thick with heat despite the late hour. Sam nodded, barely acknowledging his words, too focused on the road ahead of them. The truck stop was nothing special, just a lonely stretch of pavement off a deserted highway surrounded by dry scrub and distant hills. Ben had parked in the back away from the streetlights, hoping to get some sleep without too many interruptions. He had heard the rumors about this place, the stories of truckers hearing growls or seeing shadows that didn't belong. But it was just a rumor, right? At least, that's what Ben had always told himself. But tonight was different. A strange noise snapped him from his thoughts. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then the sound came again. A low, deliberate knocking, like something was tapping against the trailer. Ben's eyes narrowed, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "Sam," he said quietly, "did you hear that?" Sam looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" Ben motioned toward the trailer door, his heart beginning to beat faster. The knocking, it's coming from the back. They both listened intently. Sure enough, the tapping echoed again, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Ben's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I'll go check it out," Ben said, his voice steady but his pulse quickening. "You stay here." "Are you sure?" Sam asked, his voice laced with concern. It could be some kids messing around but Ben was already opening the door. He stepped out into the oppressive heat of the Texas night, his boots crunching on the gravel. The truck stop was eerily quiet now, the distant hum of the highway the only sound. As Ben approached the trailer, his boots sinking into the dust, he spotted something that made his stomach churn. Large, deep footprints in the dirt near the base of the trailer. They were unmistakable, wide with clawed toes and easily the size of a grown man's chest. His breath hitched. The knocking stopped abruptly, and a chill ran through him despite the heat. "Sam, get in the cab now." Ben's voice was low, almost urgent. Before Sam could respond, a sound far worse than any knocking erupted from the darkness. An ear-piercing roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he turned, instinctively reaching for the door of the trailer. And then, from the shadows, it appeared. A massive figure easily 10 feet tall stepped out from behind the trailer, its hulking form barely visible in the darkness. It was covered in matted fur, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the night. The creature let out another bone-shaking roar and charged toward the trailer, its steps heavy and thunderous. Ben barely had time to react. The creature slammed into the side of the trailer with a deafening crash, denting the metal with terrifying force. The truck rocked violently and Sam screamed from the cab. "Ben," Sam shouted, "get in now." Ben didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the cab, his pulse racing, adrenaline surging through his veins. Behind him, the creature howled, its heavy footsteps following in pursuit. He reached the door, slamming it open and diving into the seat, slamming the door shut just as the trailer groaned under the weight of the creature's assault. Sam floored the accelerator without a word, and the truck shot forward, tires squealing against the hot asphalt. Ben looked over his shoulder, his heart racing as they sped down the empty highway. The creature was still there, standing in the distance, watching them with those glowing eyes. For a moment, it seemed to consider following them, but then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it melted into the darkness, disappearing without a trace. Ben and Sam didn't stop driving until they were far beyond the truck stop, the sound of their engine roaring through the night, drowning out everything else. Ben glanced at Sam, who was still trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Ben muttered, his voice tight. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and turned his eyes back to the road. "But we're not going back there, ever, and neither of them did." Carlos and Danny had been driving for hours, taking in the breathtaking views as they followed the winding road along the cliffside in Colorado. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the jagged peaks and the vast valley below. They had heard about the famous scenic route, known for its views and its strange history, but neither of them had expected the experience to be quite as eerie as it was. "Look at that view," Danny said, pointing out the window. "We should stop for a minute, take it all in." Carlos nodded, already pulling off the road and into a small overlook. They stepped out of the car, breathing in the cool mountain air. The sound of distant birds and the rustling of trees filled the silence as they walked to the edge of the cliff, gazing at the sweeping landscape below. "This place is amazing," Carlos said, stretching his arms out, enjoying the vastness of the world around him. But just as they were about to sit down, a sharp noise pierced the stillness, a crackling of rocks tumbling down the cliffside, followed by a deep, guttural growl. Danny froze, her eyes snapping toward the edge of the cliff. "What was that?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Carlos strained his ears, trying to identify the sound. Another rock fell, and then something larger shifted above them, blocking the sunlight for a moment. The growl came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably not a bear. That wasn't just a rock, Carlos muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the car keys. Danny stepped back, her gaze locked on the shadow that had begun moving along the cliffside above them. It was large, far too large to be any normal animal, and it was climbing, using the jagged rocks with an eerie fluidity. "Carlos, we need to go," Danny urged, her voice tight with panic. But before they could react, the creature leapt, its massive form landing in the middle of the road with a sickening thud. The beast was monstrous, its body covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes gleaming with a primal fury. Its growl shook the air as it stepped toward them, its claws scraping against the asphalt. Carlo's heart raced. He jumped into the driver's seat, throwing the car into reverse as quickly as he could. But the road was narrow, and the edge of the cliff loomed dangerously close behind them. "Go, go, go," Danny shouted, her voice trembling as she watched the creature take a step forward, its massive frame blocking their way. The car inched backward, the tires squealing as they neared the edge of the cliff. The creature roared and lunged toward the car, its claws slicing through the air just inches from the vehicle. Carlos slammed the car into drive, barely managing to steer around the beast. They sped forward, the creature snapping at the car's rear bumper. As Carlos pushed the accelerator to the limit, he glanced in the mirror. The creature followed them for a moment, its enormous shadow chasing them along the cliffside. But just as it lunged once more, Carlos swerved, the car narrowly avoiding the beast's strike. They didn't stop until they were a safe distance away, breathing hard and shaking. The road ahead seemed endless, but neither of them dared look back. That was not what I expected from a scenic drive, Danny said, her voice still shaky. Carlos just nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The cliffside, the growls, the creature. It all felt like a distant nightmare now, but the scratches on their car were a stark reminder of the danger they'd narrowly escaped. They would never look at a scenic view the same way again. Beth and Tom had been on the road for hours, eager to visit their grandparents in Georgia. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the winding country roads. They'd been driving through thick woods, and Tom, ever the adventurous one, suggested they take a shortcut through a narrow dirt road that cut through the trees. "It'll save us time," he said, glancing at the GPS. "We can make it to Grandma's before dark." Beth hesitated. The road looked more like a path than an actual route, overgrown and barely visible through the dense foliage. "I don't know, Tom. The GPS says we're off track." But Tom, with his usual reckless confidence, had already turned the wheel. "Trust me, Beth, we'll be fine." As the car bumped along the uneven road, the atmosphere grew heavier. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the once clear path had become increasingly narrow. The woods were silent, save for the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. After a while, they came upon an old, dilapidated cabin tucked away in the shadows. "Isn't that the old cabin?" Beth asked, her voice laced with unease. Tom slowed the car as they approached, peering out the window at the weathered structure. The locals had always warned them about the cabin, saying it was haunted. There had been rumors of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, and eerie sounds drifting through the trees. Some even said they had seen figures moving inside, but no one ever dared to investigate. "It's just an old cabin," Tom dismissed with a shrug. "But yeah, it's creepy. Let's take a look." Beth's unease only grew as they passed the cabin. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Then, out of nowhere, they both heard it. A loud, thudding footstep from inside the cabin, followed by a low growl. Beth's heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Tom's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. "It's just the wind, probably an animal." But as they continued to drive, Beth could see movement inside the cabin through the cracked windows. A dark shape loomed, shifting quickly. Something, or someone, was inside. "Tom, we need to leave now." Before Tom could respond, the door to the cabin suddenly burst open with a deafening crash. A massive figure, covered in dark fur, charged out into the clearing. The creature's eyes glowed with an unnatural hunger, and its mouth was twisted into a snarling snarl as it began to lumber toward the car. Beth's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God, Tom." Tom slammed his foot on the gas, but the creature was too fast. It pounded across the ground, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. Beth could hear the sound of its heavy footsteps, each one echoing in her chest, and she turned to look behind them, seeing the hulking form drawing closer with every second. Faster, she screamed, panic rising in her throat. Tom didn't need to be told twice. He floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as they rocketed down the dirt road. The creature let out a primal roar that echoed through the woods, the sound sending a chill down their spines. Beth dared a glance in the rearview mirror and saw the creature still in pursuit, its towering form growing smaller as they gained speed. As they rounded a bend in the road, the creature faltered, stopped in its tracks, and howled in frustration. The sound reverberated through the trees, a bone-chilling noise that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It was only then that Beth allowed herself to breathe, but the terror of the creature's pursuit lingered, haunting her every thought. They didn't stop until they were miles away, the woods far behind them. The weight of the encounter sat heavily on their chests, the image of the creature's glowing eyes still fresh in their minds. "That wasn't just an animal," Beth finally whispered, her voice trembling. Tom didn't answer. He just gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. They would never forget the abandoned cabin in the woods. But more than that, they would never forget the creature that had come chasing after them, as if determined to make sure they didn't leave alive. Jessica and Ryan had been on the road for hours, winding their way through rural Alabama, heading to a small conference center for work. The GPS had been acting up all afternoon, but they'd ignored it, assuming it was just a glitch. That was until they found themselves on a narrow, unmarked road, flanked by thick woods on either side. It had all the hallmarks of a shortcut, though neither of them recognized it. "Does this look familiar to you?" Jessica asked, squinting at the screen. The map didn't match anything they'd seen before. Ryan glanced at the GPS, raising an eyebrow. "Nope, but it's supposed to be a shortcut, right? We're getting close to the hotel, according to this." Jessica wasn't so sure. The road was unpaved and winding, the trees crowding in on either side, blocking the fading daylight. The atmosphere felt wrong. As they continued down the road, the forest grew unnervingly silent, the usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves fading into an eerie stillness. "This is weird," she muttered, her grip tightening on the wheel. Ryan leaned forward, peering through the windshield into the growing darkness. "It's just a forest, Jess. Maybe the locals are exaggerating." But as if to prove him wrong, something large moved just beyond the trees. It was a shadow, too quick to be a deer or any other animal they could recognize. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. Ryan's eyes widened. "Yeah, I did. What the hell was that?" They slowed down, the sudden tension settling heavily in the car. The road felt narrower, almost as though the trees were closing in around them. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though there was no sign of anything other than the blackness of the woods. Just as she was about to ask Ryan to check the map again, the car jolted to a halt. The engine sputtered and then stopped entirely. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the dashboard. There was no reason for the car to stop. It hadn't run out of fuel. "What the hell?" she muttered, trying to restart the car. She turned the key again. "Nothing." Ryan's hand shot out, resting on her arm. "Look." Out of the corner of her eye, Jessica saw movement in the trees. It was fast, too fast, and then it happened. The car rocked violently as something slammed into the hood. A deafening, bone-shaking impact. Jessica's stomach lurched as a deep growl vibrated through the metal, rattling their bones. Her eyes locked onto the hood where long, jagged claw marks scraped down the surface, tearing through the paint with terrifying ease. "Go, go, go," Ryan shouted, his voice a sharp command. In a panic, Jessica slammed the car into gear, her hands shaking as she tried once again to start the engine. The car sputtered and then roared to life. Without thinking, she pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the tires screeching as they sped away from the mysterious presence. As they raced down the road, Jessica dared a glance in the rear-view mirror. She saw nothing but the dark road stretching behind them. But then, just beyond the trees, she caught a glimpse of it, its glowing eyes watching them, the massive silhouette of the creature lingering at the edge of the woods. Ryan didn't say a word, but they both knew what they had seen. The presence, whatever it was, had been close. Too close. Jessica kept her foot firmly pressed on the gas, not daring to slow down until they saw the first sign of civilization up ahead. The road they had turned onto was long forgotten, but they wouldn't be forgetting what had followed them into the night. As they reached the main highway, Jessica couldn't help but glance back once more. The creature was gone, but the feeling of its eyes on them lingered. There was no doubt in her mind that they had barely escaped whatever haunted the cursed back road in rural Alabama. Sarah and Mike had been looking forward to their weekend getaway to Oregon's national park for months. The thought of escaping the bustle of city life and immersing themselves in the peaceful wilderness was a dream come true. They'd driven along the narrow, winding dirt roads that led to a small, secluded campsite far away from the crowds. As they turned a corner, however, their excitement quickly turned to confusion. The campsite, usually a perfect spot to set up for the night, was eerily empty. Torn tents were scattered across the area, their fabric shredded as though something had violently torn through them. Sleeping bags, backpacks, and other belongings were strewn about, left behind in a haphazard mess. There were no signs of life, no campers, no voices, just the cold stillness of the forest surrounding them. Mike stepped out of the car, surveying the area with a puzzled frown. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered. Sarah joined him, her hand on her hip, as she surveyed the wreckage. "It looks like they left in a hurry." The air around them felt thick, charged with a strange tension, as if the forest was holding its breath. It was too quiet. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the trees. As they stepped further into the campsite, Sarah noticed something unsettling, deep scratches in the dirt, as though something large had dragged its feet. Mike crouched down beside one of the torn tents, inspecting the damage. "This looks like it was attacked by what?" Sarah asked, unease creeping into her voice. Mike stood up, his eyes scanning the woods. "Bears, maybe, but this is more than just a bear." Suddenly, a noise cut through the air, heavy breathing, labored and close. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the dense trees at the edge of the campsite. Branches snapped, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. "Mike," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, "do you hear that?" Before Mike could answer, a massive figure stepped out from the trees. It was covered in thick, matted fur, its hulking shape looming like a shadow in the dimming light. In its hands it carried a mangled tent, its edges torn and shredded, as though it had been caught in a brutal struggle. The creature's eyes glowed faintly in the fading light, and its enormous frame seemed to block out the space around it. It let out a deep, guttural roar, the sound vibrating through the air. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as the creature's gaze fixed on them. Its growl echoed through the trees, filled with a predatory hunger. Mike's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the car. "Get in the car now." They bolted toward the vehicle, Sarah's heart racing as they fumbled to get the door open. Mike slammed it shut just as the creature let out another terrifying roar. They could hear the sound of pounding footsteps, the ground shaking beneath them as it charged toward them. Then there was a sound thudding loud, deliberate strikes on the roof of the car. Mike's hands trembled as he started the engine, the car lurching forward as they sped away from the campsite. They could still hear the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind them, its growl growing louder as they tore down the dirt road. Sarah's grip on the seat tightened as the creature's roar echoed through the trees, but slowly the sound began to fade. Finally, the pounding on the roof stopped, and they didn't hear the creature's growl anymore. It was gone. Sarah glanced at Mike, her heart still racing. What was that? Mike shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know, but I don't think we're supposed to be here." The silence of the forest outside their car was deafening, but neither of them dared speak any further. The encounter had left them shaken, the terror of the chase lingering in the air. They drove faster, not daring to look back, both of them silently thankful that they had escaped the creature's deadly pursuit. The campsite, the torn tents, the scattered belongings, it was all a reminder of how quickly things could turn from peaceful to terrifying in the wilderness. As they finally reached the safety of the park's main road, Sarah let out a shaky breath. They had left the creature behind, but they both knew they would never forget the image of the hulking figure in the trees, watching them with those glowing eyes. Megan and Tony had been driving for hours, their car weaving along the winding road, surrounded by dense trees and the occasional glimpse of a distant mountain peak. The summer heat weighed heavily in the air, and the long stretch of Tennessee countryside seemed to stretch on forever. When they spotted a quiet creek just off the road, they couldn't resist the temptation to stop and cool off. They parked by the water's edge, the sounds of birds and insects filling the air as they stepped out of the car. The creek glistened under the midday sun, its waters clear but flowing steadily, as though it had been carved into the earth by time itself. The perfect spot to unwind. I'll race you to the water. Tony grinned, already kicking off his shoes and wading into the creek. Megan laughed and followed him, her laughter echoing through the trees. But as she made her way toward the water, her foot caught on something, broken tree branches, scattered in a way that didn't seem natural. She paused, glancing around. The air around them smelled off, faintly sour, like something had been rotting nearby. "Megan, what's wrong?" Tony called from the water, his voice carefree. She shook off the unease, not wanting to ruin the mood. "Nothing, just some weird branches," she said, smiling as she dipped her toes into the cool water. They sat down on a large rock near the creek's edge, letting the water rush around their feet. But the odd feeling lingered, the sensation of being watched gnawing at the back of her mind. Tony didn't seem to notice, too busy splashing water playfully. Then it happened. A series of deliberate splashes rang out from the other side of the creek. Megan froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound wasn't from the normal flow of the water, nor was it the playful splashing of fish or a stray animal. These splashes were too large, too purposeful. She slowly turned her head and her breath caught in her throat. On the opposite bank, just beyond the trees, a hulking shadow loomed. Its form was massive, its movements slow and calculated. Megan couldn't make out its full shape, but the way it shifted between the trees, barely visible in the undergrowth, made her blood run cold. She opened her mouth to speak, but Tony had already stood up, unaware of what was happening. "What's up, Meg? What are you?" A loud roar split the air, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing into the creek. Megan's eyes widened in horror as the creature, fully emerging from the trees, stepped into the water. It was enormous, its form hunched and covered in matted fur, its eyes glowing with an eerie intensity. It raised one massive arm, flinging a large rock toward them with terrifying force. The rock hit the water with a deafening splash, sending waves rippling across the creek. "Megan, get back!" Tony shouted, his voice laced with panic now. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the car. The creature let out another guttural roar, sending a chill down their spines. It splashed into the creek, charging toward them with unnatural speed, its hulking body moving through the water like a predator closing in on its prey. Megan's heart raced as they sprinted toward the car, slipping on the wet rocks as they tried to make their way back. Behind them, the creature's steps grew louder, each splash echoing in the silence around them. The air grew thick with its stench, a foul mix of decay and something else, something primal. They reached the car, breathless and shaking. Tony fumbled for the keys, his hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, they slammed the doors shut and sped off. As they glanced through the rear-view mirror, they saw the creature standing in the creek, watching them. Its eyes gleamed in the dimming light, unblinking and steady, as if it had been there all along, waiting. The drive away felt endless, the sound of the engine humming over the silence, but neither of them spoke. The only sound was the thundering of their hearts, still racing from the encounter. Megan's eyes kept darting back to the rear-view mirror, the image of the creature seared into her memory. When they finally reached a more populated area, the tension between them broke. But neither of them would ever forget the creature in the creek. Its stare, its roar, and the crushing fear that had gripped them as it watched them drive away. Jake and Alina leaned against the hood of their car, looking at the abandoned tunnel in front of them. The old road, once a bustling route, had long since been forgotten, and now the tunnel lay half collapsed, a relic of the past. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked, glancing at the tunnel's dark mouth. Jake grinned, his adventurous spirit shining through. "Come on, it'll be fun. It's just an old tunnel. Besides, we'll have a great story for the ride home." Elena hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of her. "All right, but if anything weird happens, we're out of there." With a flash of excitement, they grabbed their flashlights and ventured toward the tunnel. The silence around them was overwhelming, and as they entered the narrow passage, the world outside seemed to disappear. The walls of the tunnel were crumbling in places, but the path ahead was still clear. As they moved deeper into the darkness, Elena's flashlight flickered against the whetstone, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jake joked, trying to keep the mood light, but the unease in the air was palpable. "Do you hear that?" Elena whispered, her voice tense. Jake stopped walking and listened. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. A faint scratching noise like claws scraping against stone. "Probably just some animals," Jake said, trying to convince himself as much as Elena. But even as he spoke, the sound grew louder, echoing through the tunnel. They kept walking, but the air grew colder, the darkness thicker. As they moved further, they began to notice strange markings on the walls. Deep claw marks, some fresh, some worn with time. Jake knelt down, running his fingers along the grooves. The marks were too wide, too deep to be from any animal they knew. "What could have done this?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly. Before Jake could answer, a deep, rumbling growl reverberated through the tunnel, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound, and Elena's eyes widened in terror. "I think it's time we go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But before they could turn around, something massive emerged from the darkness ahead of them, blocking the tunnel's exit. The creature was enormous, its body hulking and covered in matted fur. Its eyes gleamed like pale lanterns in the dark, and its teeth glistened as it bared them in a snarl. Jake and Elena froze, paralyzed by fear. The creature took a step toward them, its heavy footsteps echoing as it crouched down, its long claws scraping against the stone floor. The air was thick with the smell of wet fur and decay, and the growl that rumbled from the creature's chest made their blood run cold. "We need to get out now," Jake shouted, grabbing Elena's arm. They bolted, running through the tunnel, their hearts pounding as the sound of the creature's growls grew louder. They reached a narrow side opening, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Elena went first, her hands scraping against the jagged rocks as she pushed herself through. Jake followed, his heart racing in his chest. They tumbled out of the tunnel and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. They didn't stop to look back, sprinting toward their car as fast as they could. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, before finally managing to unlock the door. They jumped in, slamming the doors shut. As they sped away, they dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The creature was standing in the tunnel's entrance, its massive form outlined against the dark sky. Its glowing eyes followed them as they drove away, the deep growl lingering in the distance. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Finally, Elena broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it followed us?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't, because he was already wondering the same thing. David adjusted the lens of his camera, capturing the sun as it dipped below the canyon's jagged edge. The colors of the desert stretched out before him in a breathtaking array of purples and oranges. He had come to New Mexico for this, the perfect shot. Mia, his assistant, stood beside him, peering through her binoculars at the distant rocks, her mind not entirely on the work at hand. "This place is beautiful," Mia remarked, taking in the vast expanse of the canyon. "Too quiet, though. Doesn't it feel off to you?" David glanced around, his eyes narrowing as he noticed several animal carcasses scattered near the canyon's edge. The bodies were mangled and stripped of flesh, their bones twisted in unnatural ways. The remains were unsettlingly fresh, not the usual signs of scavenging from the desert's wildlife. He snapped a few photos, but his gut told him something wasn't right. "Yeah, I noticed that too," he said, lowering the camera. "Let's wrap up here before it gets dark. We're not exactly alone out here." Mia followed him back to the car, her senses prickling with a feeling of unease. The air was growing colder as the sun continued its descent. The canyon, once awe-inspiring, now felt like a looming presence, dark and oppressive. As they got into the car, David started the engine, but before he could shift into gear, a deep, guttural growl echoed from the canyon below. Both of them froze. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. David turned the engine off and rolled down the window, straining to listen. The growl was distant but unmistakably animalistic. It vibrated through the air, sending a ripple of dread down his spine. "It's probably just a coyote or something," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his attempt to reassure them both. But the growls grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. They could feel the sound in their chests, a primal rumble that wasn't of this world. David looked at Mia, the color draining from her face. "Mia, we need to leave," he said urgently, but as he reached for the gearshift, a sharp, rustling sound came from above. Both of them turned, their eyes following the sound. Slowly, something large began to climb up the steep canyon walls, a massive shadow moving with terrifying grace. The creature's form was indistinct at first, but as it neared the edge of the canyon, its shape became clear, a hulking figure ape-like and covered in thick, dark fur. David's breath caught in his throat. The creature paused at the canyon's edge, its glowing eyes locking with theirs. It stood motionless for a moment, a hulking, towering silhouette against the dying light of the sun. Then, with a terrifying roar, it charged, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. "Drive now," David shouted, his voice rising in panic. Mia didn't need another word. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, the car screeching as it lurched forward. In the rearview mirror, they saw the creature still charging, effortlessly keeping pace along the edge of the canyon, its immense frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. The creature's growl filled the air, a sound so deep and primal it seemed to reverberate through the earth. David's heart raced as they sped down the narrow road, the creature's growls fading only slightly, its relentless pursuit still palpable. The car swerved around a sharp bend, and the creature's figure disappeared into the blackness of the canyon, swallowed whole by the night. David dared a final glance over his shoulder, but saw nothing, just the empty road and the cold, still silence of the desert night. "Do you think it's gone?" Mia asked, her voice trembling as she gripped the seat. David didn't answer. He wasn't sure. What he knew for certain was that they had come too close to something that wasn't meant to be found. "Let's just get out of here," he finally said, his gaze fixed ahead, hands tight on the wheel, not daring to look back again. Karen's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she drove along the endless stretch of highway, the darkened Montana landscape rolling past them. It was nearing midnight, and the soft hum of the engine was the only sound filling the car. Alex, her teenage son, was leaning against the window, eyes glazed from the long hours on the road. "Mom, can we pull over? I need to stretch my legs," Alex asked, his voice muffled by a yawn. Karen glanced at the empty highway ahead. A secluded rest area loomed in the distance, the dimly lit sign marking a break in the monotony. "Sure, just a quick stop," she replied, pulling off the road. The car bumped over the gravel as she parked under a flickering light near the entrance. The night was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that felt too thick, too heavy. Karen sighed, thankful for the break, as Alex unbuckled and opened the door. "Don't go too far," she warned, her eyes tracking him as he wandered toward the bushes that lined the edge of the parking lot. "I won't, just a few minutes," Alex called back, disappearing into the shadows. Karen sat for a moment, staring out into the dark expanse of trees and dirt. The faint smell of pine and earth lingered in the air. A soft rustling sound broke the silence, followed by another, louder than the first. Karen's hand instinctively reached for the door handle, her heart picking up pace as the sounds seemed to grow closer, too deliberate to be wind or animals. She turned her head toward the bushes where Alex had gone, squinting into the blackness. That's when she saw them. Two small, glowing orbs hovering just beyond the tree line. At first, she thought it might be a reflection from a car's headlights, but the movement wasn't right. The eyes shifted, blinked, and then slowly tilted upward, revealing a shape that was far too large to be anything she could recognize. A breathless chill washed over her as the rustling grew louder, the figure emerging from the shadows. It was massive, its silhouette dwarfing the trees around it. The creature's body was covered in thick fur, and its broad, hulking frame was hunched forward, a low growl vibrating through the air. The eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue, and as it took a step closer, Karen's blood ran cold. "Alex!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with panic. The creature let out a terrifying roar, its footfalls shaking the ground beneath her. It was coming straight for Alex, who was still poking around the bushes, unaware of the looming danger. Without thinking, Karen flung open the door, her legs barely touching the gravel as she sprinted toward Alex. "Alex, get in the car now," she yelled, the words catching in her throat. Alex looked up, confusion washing over his face for a split second before he saw the creature charging toward him. The ground trembled with each step the beast took, its immense size closing the distance between them in an instant. Alex's eyes widened in terror as he turned, his legs moving faster than he ever thought possible. He reached the car just as the creature let out another ear-splitting roar, stomping toward him with bone, shaking force. Karen yanked open the door and Alex dove inside, the creature's breath hot against the window as she slammed it shut. Heart racing, Karen threw the car into reverse, her hands shaking on the wheel. She could hear the creature's footsteps thudding like thunder behind them. She floored the gas pedal, the car jerking forward as they sped away from the rest area. In the rearview mirror, Karen caught a glimpse of the creature standing in the lights of the parking lot, its hulking form outlined against the dim glow. For a moment, it just stared after them, motionless, before disappearing into the darkness. Karen's hands were still trembling on the wheel as she accelerated down the empty road, the distance between them and the creature growing with every mile. The silence that fell in the car was thick, broken only by their uneven breaths. "Mom, what was that?" Alex finally asked, his voice small, his face pale. Karen didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Her only thought focused on one thing, getting as far away from that rest stop as possible. The old, creaking tires of Emma and Tyler's car hummed steadily along the desolate highway, the dense forest pressing in on either side like an impenetrable wall of darkness. West Virginia was known for its winding roads and isolation, and the siblings had embraced the quiet solitude of the journey, just the two of them and the endless stretches of trees. But tonight, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the air felt heavier, colder, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "We should stop and refuel," Tyler said, glancing over at Emma, his voice breaking the silence. Emma nodded, adjusting the map on her lap. "There's a gas station up ahead. I think it's the last one for miles." The headlights of their car illuminated the rundown sign ahead, Green's Gas and Goods, flickering in the fading light. It was old decades past its prime, and the surrounding area looked abandoned. A small rusted shed sat to one side, the windows boarded up, and the trees behind it seemed to grow unnaturally close to the building. Yet the faded gas pumps still stood, weird, Emma said as Tyler pulled the car into the parking lot. "Looks like no one's been here in years. Maybe they just don't get a lot of business," Tyler shrugged. "I'm just glad we don't have to drive another 30 miles on fumes." They stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet as the air grew colder. The station was eerily silent. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees, a soft whisper in the otherwise dead quiet. Emma moved toward the pump, tapping the nozzle into the gas tank, while Tyler fumbled for his wallet. "Everything's so off here," Emma murmured, her eyes scanning the woods around them. Tyler didn't respond. Instead, he leaned against the car, distracted by his phone. The chill in the air was beginning to bite, and the sound of distant growls, barely audible at first, reached Emma's ears. She froze, her hand still gripping the pump. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps the rumble of a far-off truck. But as the growls grew louder, sharper, her stomach tightened with unease. She glanced over at Tyler, but he didn't seem to notice. He was still staring at his phone, oblivious. "Tyler," she called, her voice a little too sharp, a little too panicked. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" He looked up from his screen, scanning the area. "It's probably just some animals or something, maybe a dog." Emma's eyes darted to the tree line. The growls were more distinct now, low and guttural, like something was lurking just out of sight. Something massive. She could feel it in her bones, the unnatural stillness of the air around them. The trees seemed to be closing in, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention. "Tyler," she whispered urgently, "we need to leave." Before he could respond, a figure emerged from the darkness of the trees. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, huge and indistinct. But as it stepped into the dim light of the gas station, the outline of a massive creature became clear. It was taller than any man, its form obscured by thick matted fur. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural yellow light, the pupils narrow slits. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and her heart pounded in her chest as the creature's gaze fixed on them. The growls grew louder, more menacing, now unmistakably coming from the thing standing at the edge of the lot. "Tyler," she screamed. Tyler turned just in time to see the creature take a step forward, the earth shaking slightly beneath its weight. It moved with terrifying speed, its long, clawed hand slamming against the side of their car with a sickening crack. The sound of glass breaking echoed in the stillness as the creature's claws scraped the window, leaving deep gouges in the glass. Emma screamed, pulling Tyler away from the car. "We have to go now." Without a second thought, Tyler yanked open the door and scrambled into the driver's seat. Emma followed suit, slamming the door shut just as the creature let out a deafening roar. The vehicle lurched as Tyler floored the accelerator, the tires screeching against the gravel as the car shot forward. The creature's massive form loomed in the rear-view mirror, its long strides keeping pace with the car. It was faster than they'd ever imagined, chasing them with a determination that sent chills down their spines. "Faster?" Emma cried, her voice trembling as she gripped the seat. "It's right behind us." Tyler pushed the car faster, the engine roaring in protest. But no matter how fast they went, the creature's thundering footsteps seemed to echo just behind them. The trees blurred past, the headlights cutting through the thickening fog, the low growls of the creature growing louder. They drove for miles, the sound of the creature following them, always just out of sight, but close enough to send terror coursing through their veins. Finally, they saw the bridge up ahead, an old, rickety structure that spanned the narrow creek running alongside the road. Without hesitation, Tyler pushed the car forward, praying they could make it across in time. As they crossed the bridge, the heavy footsteps behind them faltered. The creature stopped just short of the bridge's entrance, standing motionless at the edge of the woods. For a split second, Emma thought they were safe, but when she glanced back, the creature was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. Tyler didn't slow down until they were well past the bridge, the hum of the car's engine drowning out the fear pounding in their chests. When they finally stopped at a small diner miles down the road, neither of them spoke for a long while. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the unspoken question that had been hanging in the air since the moment they had seen that shadow in the woods. "What the hell was that?" Emma asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. Tyler's eyes were wide, still fixed on the road ahead, as if the creature might appear at any moment. "I don't know, but we're not staying around to find out." And as they pulled out of the diner's parking lot, the warning sign they had seen earlier echoed in Emma's mind, "Beware of night stalkers." They now knew exactly why the locals never traveled these roads after dark.